So imagine checking your bank account, right? And seeing that you are like 60% richer today than you were back in the year 2000.
I mean, I'll take it. Sounds fantastic.
Right. You'd probably feel pretty secure about your future. But what if that number is a complete statistical lie?
Just completely made up.
Yeah. Or, what if that number is actually masking the fact that the economic engine of your entire country is in a deep, irreversible decline?
Well, it is the ultimate diagnostic mirage, really. We rely on these massive macroeconomic spreadsheets to tell us if our societies are thriving or failing.
Sure, we trust the math.
Right, but when you actually look at the math underneath all of it, the formulas they're fundamentally broken.
And that is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are grabbing a genuinely fascinating and honestly brutally provocative stack of sources. We're zeroing in on a conversation from a YouTube show called The Iconoclasts.
Yeah, featuring economists Yanis Varoufakis and Wolfgang Münchau.
Exactly, and the specific discussion is titled, "The UK Can't Recover from This." So our mission today, for you, the listener, is to extract the most vital, kind of counterintuitive aha moments from this highly complex economic debate.
Because it gets really deep.
It does. By the time we finish, you're going to have a completely different lens through which to view global headlines. We are unpacking a fiercely contrarian take on the economic realities of the United Kingdom, Europe, and the United States.
And exploring this very specific argument, right? The idea that standard economic narratives, the ones championed by Nobel laureates and politicians alike, are actually hiding a massive historic global shift toward China.
Yeah, it's huge. But before we get into it, we need to set some ground rules.
Oh, absolutely. Look, we have to establish up front, this conversation takes no prisoners.
None at all.
The economists in the source material, they go after everyone. I mean, they critique decades of neoliberalism, they attack austerity measures, and they name-drop political figures and movements across the entire spectrum.
Right, nobody is safe.
Nobody. They take aim at Andy Burnham and the American Democratic Party just as fiercely as they analyze the rise of AMGA, the AFD in Germany, or Nigel Farage's Reform UK.
Which means we really need to clarify our role here. Our job today isn't to take a side on any of these highly charged political battles. We aren't endorsing any specific party or ideology mentioned in this video.
Exactly.
We are acting entirely as your neutral guides. We're just mapping out the specific economic frameworks and the very blunt arguments these economists are putting forward so you can evaluate the logic for yourself.
Because honestly, the core premise they are presenting is incredibly radical. They are suggesting that almost everything Western policymakers think they know about generating economic growth, down to how we measure the global value of something as basic as a Big Mac, is an illusion.
It's wild. And to dismantle that illusion, the video doesn't start with some abstract theory about global trade. It starts on the ground, very locally, looking at the UK economy. Right. They use a hypothetical political scenario to expose a massive misunderstanding about how modern states handle money. So they set up this situation. Imagine Andy Burnham, who is a very prominent British politician, currently the mayor of Greater Manchester, takes over 10 Downing Street from Keir Starmer.
Okay.
And Burnham's massive flagship promise to the British public is that he is finally going to fix the stagnant UK economy through a huge surge in public sector investment and regional devolution.
I mean, it's a very standard political pitch, right? Like, elect me, and I will unleash the power of the public purse to rebuild our infrastructure.
Exactly.
But the immediate, just unyielding critique from the source is that this plan is mathematically doomed from the start.
I want to break down why, because on the surface, more investment sounds like the exact right medicine for a struggling economy. Where does the math break down there?
Well, it breaks down in the ratios.
Yep.
The source points out that in the UK, public sector investment accounts for only about 20% of total investment.
20%.
Just 20. And the vast majority of that 20% is already spoken for. It's tied up in keeping the National Health Service, the NHS, afloat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the other 80% of all investment in the UK economy is entirely driven by the private sector. And they note that in other European democracies, like Germany, the public investment slice is even smaller, hovering around 10%.
So if a politician is promising to save the entire economy by tinkering with just the 20% slice of the pie,
it's futile. Because if you rely solely on the state's 20% to generate massive economic turnaround, you're ignoring the elephant in the room.
Right.
Even a microscopic drop in confidence or spending within that massive 80% private sector chunk
right.
will instantly and totally wipe out any marginal gains you achieve by bumping up the public sector budget.
Okay, and let me play devil's advocate here, even if the public slice is small, surely spending more money on public works is better than nothing, right?
You'd think so.
Yeah. This is where the video drops its first major conceptual bomb. They argue that we are all suffering from a gigantic misunderstanding of vocabulary. We are equating expenditure with investment.
This is a crucial distinction. In the eyes of these economists, just because a government is spending billions of pounds, that does not mean a single dime of it is actually being invested into the future productive capacity of the country.
It's just money out the door.
Exactly.
They use water privatization in the UK as their first major case study to prove this. And man, they do not mince words. They flatly call the privatization of British water an act of vandalism.
Vandalism is the exact word used. Let's look at the mechanism of how this actually played out, because it perfectly illustrates the expenditure versus investment trap.
Please do.
So, starting in the late 1980s, the UK government sold off regional water authorities to the private sector. The pitch was, that the private sector would be more efficient.
Sure, the classic free market argument.
Right. But what actually happened, according to the source, is that private equity firms moved in. They bought these regional water monopolies and immediately loaded the companies up with astronomical amounts of debt.
Wait, if they are taking on debt, what is that money being used for? I mean, usually a company takes on debt to build a new factory or upgrade systems,
And that is what should happen in a healthy capitalist model.
Yeah.
But here, the debt wasn't used to replace Victorian-era plumbing or build new reservoirs. The money was effectively siphoned out of the companies to pay massive dividends to the shareholders and the private equity owners.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Fast forward a few decades, and the infrastructure is collapsing, the pipes are leaking, and because the treatment plants haven't been upgraded, literal raw sewage starts spilling into the rivers and coastlines.
Which has been a massive ongoing scandal in the UK press.
Exactly. So the private companies drop the ball entirely. They extract the wealth, leave the debt, and let the infrastructure rot. When the crisis reaches a breaking point, when the public is outraged by sewage in their local rivers, who has to fix it?
It's the state.
The state. The government suddenly has to step in, either through massive subsidies, emergency interventions, or effectively taking on the burden of the disaster. On the National Treasury's spreadsheet, government expenditure on the water sector suddenly skyrockets.
But the crucial point is that this skyrocketing expenditure isn't building a state-of-the-art 21st century water grid. It's just paying the ransom to stop the bleeding.
Precisely. It is crisis management.
Yeah.
Has any actual investment occurred that pushes the economy forward? No. The source describes this dynamic as pure plunder.
Let's lock this down with an analogy. It sounds like you have a bucket full of holes, right?
Okay.
Instead of paying someone to patch the holes, which would be an investment in a working bucket, you are paying exorbitant prices to buy gallons of expensive water just to keep the bucket artificially full.
Right.
And then the government turns around and brags to the voters about how much money they are spending on water, hoping no one notices the floor is entirely flooded.
That analogy perfectly captures the absurdity of it. You are confusing the exorbitant cost of mitigating a disaster with the cost of actual progress. And the source insists this exact same illusion is playing out within the National Health Service.
Which is like the sacred cow of British politics.
Absolutely.
How does the expenditure illusion apply to the NHS? Because healthcare budgets are always going up. We constantly hear about record spending.
They are going up, but where is that money actually going? The argument laid out here is that the NHS has been systematically overwhelmed by new bureaucratic layers. The system has developed a culture obsessed with metrics, auditing, and measurement.
So lots of paperwork.
So much paperwork. To handle all of this, a vast, highly paid managerial class has been created.
So the administrative footprint is expanding.
Rapidly.
Eh?
Meanwhile, the actual frontline workers, the doctors, the nurses, the people actually treating the sick, are fighting for a shrinking slice of the overall budgetary pie.
That sounds incredibly frustrating for the medical staff.
It is. Furthermore, the source points to a new dynamic where the NHS is locked into incredibly expensive deals with American big pharma and large U.S. tech companies.
Oh, like who?
They specifically mention Palantir, a massive data analytics firm.
Huh.
The claim made in the video is that these structural changes in foreign corporate dependencies have effectively doubled the bill for pharmaceuticals and data management.
Which brings us right back to the core thesis, the total expenditure balloons.
Right.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer can stand up in Parliament and say, we have authorized record funding for the NHS. The budget looks historically massive, but the actual healthcare capacity, the ability to physically put a patient in a bed, treat them quickly, and discharge them healthily, has not increased proportionately.
In many areas, capacity has actually fallen. The money is being vaporized in layers of bureaucracy and corporate rent-seeking.
Wow.
And the third pillar they use to demonstrate this is defense spending, which is, highly relevant right now given the global geopolitical climate.
Right. There's a massive push across NATO right now for countries to increase their defense budgets. A lot of politicians are pushing to raise spending from the baseline of 2% of GDP up to 2.5 or even 3.5%. Logically, as a citizen, you hear that and think, great, we are spending roughly 50% more on defense. Therefore, our military will be 50% more capable.
But the source argues that is a complete fallacy. If a government's primary mandate is simply to hit an arbitrary macroeconomic metric like spend 3.5% of GDP, they aren't actually shopping for the best value.
Right, they just have to spend the cash.
And the defense contractors know this. If a supplier knows the government must push billions of pounds out the door by the end of the fiscal year to hit their political target, the absolute easiest thing for that supplier to do is simply raise the prices of the missiles, tanks, and planes they are already building.
So the goal shifts from acquiring better defense infrastructure to simply successfully spending the budget.
Exactly. The expenditure goes up, the GDP metric is achieved, the politicians declare victory, but the actual tangible increase in defensive capability is negligible.
Okay, this paints a fairly grim picture of state incompetence.
It does.
But why is this happening? Why is the UK, and by extension many Western bureaucracies, according to this source, so uniquely terrible at turning expenditure into genuine physical investment? Are the politicians just foolish?
The source pushes past the idea of mere foolishness and points to deep-seated structural rot.
What kind of rot?
Well, they highlight an outdated civil service that is paralyzed by risk aversion. But more specifically, they point to the legal architecture of the country itself, specifically the incredibly complex freehold rules in the UK.
Let's pause on freehold rules, because for someone listening who isn't a British property lawyer, what exactly is the friction here? What does that mean?
In simple terms, freehold refers to outright ownership of property and the land it stands on. In the UK, the legal protections and the processes required for the state to compel the sale of privately owned land for public use are notoriously agonizing.
Just slow.
Slow, drawn out, and astronomically expensive. Every inch of land is contested.
They bring up the HS2 rail project to illustrate this, right?
Yes, HS2 High Speed 2. It was supposed to be a state-of-the-art railway connecting London to the north of England.
I've read about this. It's been a mess.
It has become a global punchline for cost overruns and massive delays, and large sections of it have simply been cancelled. The source contrasts the UK's legal paralysis with how France operates.
Okay, so how does France build a high-speed rail line?
When the French state decides a high-speed rail line is in the national interest, the government steps in with a much stronger mandate. They survey the route, they claim the necessary land, and they compensate the property owners with a predetermined, non-negotiable sum.
Boom, done.
Right. It is a decisive exercise of state power for the sake of national infrastructure. The project gets built. In the UK, the legal framework guarantees that acquiring land for a large-scale public work will take years of litigation, environmental reviews, and payouts.
Bleeding the budget dry.
Bleeding the project's budget dry before a single track is laid.
So even if a politician like Andy Burnham comes in with the best intentions and a massive checkbook, the legal and structural system itself acts like a concrete wall against progress.
And this structural failure circles back to their critique of privatization. They argue that the entire neoliberal project of the 1980s and 90s misunderstood why certain markets function well.
Because privatization isn't universally bad, right? I mean, we aren't using state-owned rotary phones anymore.
Exactly, and the source acknowledges that. They point to telecommunications as the genuine success story of privatization.
Right.
When state-owned telecom monopolies were broken up, it created a fiercely competitive market. Multiple companies were fighting for your cell phone plan, which drove prices down and forced rapid technological innovation.
But you can't have multiple companies laying competing water pipes to your kitchen sink.
Precisely. The source argues that privatization was applied blindly to natural monopolies like rail, gas, and water. True market competition in the railway sector wouldn't just be having a private company run the London to Manchester line instead of the government.
What would it be?
True competition would require 4 or 5 completely different rail operators running different trains on the exact same physical track, all offering you different ticket prices at the station.
Which is, logistically impossible.
Completely. Because that level of true competition was never structurally achieved, these privatized public utilities didn't become engines of innovation. The source bluntly states they essentially devolved into racketeering monopolies.
Racketeering, that's a strong word.
It is. They have a captive market, no real competition, and zero incentive to invest in the underlying infrastructure.
Okay, if we accept this premise that pouring money into broken, monopolized public systems just creates an expenditure illusion without any real investment, what is the alternative? What should governments be doing instead? Because we can't just stop fixing the pipes.
This brings us to a massive pivot in the conversation. The source argues that while the West is endlessly debating how to fix leaky Victorian pipes and mismanaged rail lines, they are entirely missing the boat on the industries that will actually define the future of the global economy.
And this introduces what they call the second gigantic misunderstanding in modern economics,
Right.
the myth of the trade-off.
This is a foundational concept. The prevailing orthodox view in Western economics for decades has been that public investment and private investment are fundamentally at odds.
Right.
They are viewed as competing for the same limited pool of capital, labor, and resources.
The idea being that if the government taxes the economy to build, like a massive solar farm, they are draining money out of the private sector that a brilliant entrepreneur could have used to invent a better battery. The government is crowding out private innovation.
Yes, that is the exact fear. But the source vehemently rejects this. They argue that historical evidence proves the exact opposite. Intelligent, targeted public investment should crowd in private investment.
Crowd in.
It should act as the catalyst that unlocks private sector risk-taking.
They point to some massive historical precedents for this.
They do. They look at the New Deal in the United States during the 1930s. The government didn't just spend money. It built the Hoover Dam, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the massive electrical grids.
Right, they built the foundation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That state-funded backbone created the foundational infrastructure that allowed American private manufacturing to dominate the 20th century. They also point to Harold Wilson's technological push in the UK during the 1960s, the white heat of technology, where the state actively tried to seed advanced industries.
But the most urgent example they bring up isn't historical. It's happening right now.
Correct. The ultimate modern example of public money crowding in private innovation is the modern Chinese economy.
Okay.
But before we cross the globe to China, the source highlights a really stark, almost painful paradox right at home in the UK to prove how broken the current Western model is.
Ah, yes. The City of London.
Yes, the City of London is one of the most powerful, massive global financial hubs on Earth. It handles gigantic quantities of liquidity. We are talking about absolute rivers of finance circulating every single second.
Trillions of dollars in derivatives, stocks, bonds, foreign exchange, just an ocean of money.
Exactly. And yet the source points out that despite this ocean of capital sloshing around in London, an abysmally small fraction of it ever trickles down into productive investment in the real UK economy.
So it's not actually building anything.
No, it isn't being used to build state-of-the-art semiconductor factories in Yorkshire or to fund massive domestic biotech breakthroughs.
The money is just circulating in a closed, highly lucrative financial loop, generating fees for bankers, but doing nothing for the physical reality of the country.
Which leads to the source's most damning diagnosis for the West: a massive secular innovation deficit. They argue that Europe, and the UK specifically, essentially stopped innovating in a structural economic sense back in the 1980s and 1990s.
The video is incredibly bleak about this. When they look at the horizon of critical new technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, next-generation digital infrastructure, advanced battery technology, they see exactly two players. It is an American story, or it is a Chinese story.
Yeah, Europe isn't even in the arena.
They focus heavily on artificial intelligence to illustrate how far ahead China is moving, specifically bringing up a Chinese AI model called Kimi K3.
Let's break this down, because the way they frame China's success is really important. They don't claim China is some magical font of original invention.
No, they are very clear about that. China did not invent the microchip. They didn't invent the foundational architecture of the internet or digital technology. But while the West was inventing these things and then resting on its laurels, China aggressively structurally invested in them.
Right. And what is the result with this Kimi K3 model? The source claims that the Kimi K3 AI model currently performs on par with the absolute top-tier, cutting-edge American models developed by heavyweights like OpenAI and Anthropic.
That's a huge claim.
It is. But there's a massive structural difference in how it is deployed.
Right. The video points out that unlike the American models, which are, tightly guarded, closed-source systems designed to generate massive corporate profits, this top-tier Chinese model is open source, and it is being run on a not-for-profit basis.
Right. Even if the parent company developing Kimi K3 makes its billions elsewhere in the tech ecosystem, they are offering this foundational AI architecture for free or at cost to the rest of the domestic market.
Wait, why would they do that? That goes against every instinct of Silicon Valley capitalism.
Because it's a completely different model of capitalism directed by the state. This highlights the stark contrast between the Chinese approach and what the source sees as the European failure. According to the video, the Chinese government operates with a ruthlessly clear vision.
Right.
They identify the vital sectors that will dictate global power in 20 years. Electric mobility, the entirety of the battery supply chain, the refinement of rare earth metals, and artificial intelligence.
But it's vital to understand the mechanism here, because when Westerners hear Chinese state control, we often imagine a classic Soviet-style communist system where the government just owns the factory and dictates the production quotas.
Right.
The video says that is completely wrong.
It is a massive misconception. The source is very careful to emphasize that the Chinese are not communists in the sense of owning all these tech companies outright. The mechanism is far more sophisticated. What happens is that provincial and local governments across China act almost like massive venture capital funds.
Like VCs.
Exactly. They provide staggering amounts of seed funding, land, and resources to private Chinese companies.
Okay, so the state funds them. But then what? Do they just create national champions and protect them from competition?
No, and this is the genius of their system, according to the source. Once these local governments fund, say, 50 different private electric vehicle startups, they don't protect them. They throw them into a fiercely competitive, brutal, domestic, do-or-die battle with one another.
A battle royale.
It is an incredibly aggressive, hyper-capitalist arena, but it is fueled entirely by state seed money. The companies bleed each other dry, fighting for market share, driving costs down to the absolute floor, and forcing rapid, desperate innovation.
And whoever survives that domestic bloodbath is then unleashed onto the global market as an unstoppable, hyper-efficient juggernaut.
Exactly. That is how the Chinese state crowds in private investment. Now, contrast that mechanism with how the source describes Europe's approach to these exact same technologies.
The video uses a very specific phrase. They say Europe suffers from Luddite tendencies.
Yes. They argue that Europe's primary response to the digital revolution has been an obsession with regulation over innovation.
Oh, yeah. The GDPR and AI Act.
Right. While the U.S. and China are locked in a race to build the most powerful AI, Europe is spending its energy writing the most comprehensive AI data protection laws.
They view technology as a threat to be managed rather than a frontier to be conquered.
Precisely. They are trying to defend themselves against the future rather than leading it. And this deeply defensive posture leads to the source's ultimate devastating conclusion about the continent. Europe is slowly transforming into a museum.
Okay, I have to jump in here and push back on this narrative because this is where the macroeconomic theory collides with human reality.
Fair enough.
The video calls Europe a museum, implying it's a dusty relic. But, I've been to Europe. Millions of people travel there every year. The streets are clean. The healthcare is largely free, the food is incredible, and the citizens have a remarkably high quality of life.
Oh.
Isn't there incredible, tangible value in that stability? I mean, is it really fair to call a society a museum if the people living inside it are comfortable, safe, and happy? Must every society be a hyper-capitalist war zone to be considered successful?
It is a fantastic question, and it gets to the heart of the debate. The source actually addresses this comfortable decline head-on. They outline what they call the stages of decline. And to prove that you can be wealthy, comfortable, and still doomed, they use the absolute titan of the European economy as their case study, the German car industry.
You cannot talk about European economic might without talking about BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen. They are the pillar of the continent's manufacturing.
Exactly. So how does an industry that is currently rich, prestigious, and successful enter a terminal decline? The source breaks it down.
Let's hear it.
Stage 1 is a hidden drop in core investment. The company's making billions today, but the board decides to maximize shareholder dividends rather than sinking those billions into the high-risk, unproven technology of tomorrow, like next-generation solid-state batteries or fully autonomous driving software.
They play it safe. They focus on making their internal combustion engines like 3% more efficient instead of reinventing the wheel.
Right. Then comes stage 2, falling profit margins.
Yeah.
Because they didn't lead the innovation wave, they suddenly find themselves competing with a Chinese EV company that has better battery technology and a much lower price point.
But wait, the German companies are still selling millions of cars globally.
Yes, and this is why the decline is so insidious. The factories are still open, the cars are rolling off the line, and they might even hold on to their global market share for a few more years based on brand prestige alone.
Right, because it's a Mercedes.
Exactly. But to do that against superior, cheaper competition, they have to slash their prices. They have to sell those millions of cars at significantly lower profit margins just to stay relevant.
Okay, I see where this is going. If the profit margin shrinks, the financial pie gets smaller.
And that is where the macroeconomic rot hits the street level. Less profit at Volkswagen means there is less money available for annual wage increases for the German factory workers.
Oh, wow.
It means Volkswagen goes to their local part suppliers in Bavaria and says, "We need you to cut your prices by 10%, or we go out of business." It means less tax revenue for the state and less disposable income flowing into the local trickle-down economy.
So to answer my question about living happily without innovation,
The source argues that your strategy works beautifully, but only for a very limited window, maybe 5 to 10 years. You can coast on the momentum of past investments. You can enjoy the wealth generated by the previous generation's risk-taking.
but eventually.
But eventually, gravity takes over. A system that is built only to preserve its current status rather than to violently evolve inevitably runs out of momentum. It is, in their exact words, doomed.
Okay, so if we accept this premise that Europe is coasting on fumes in a state of secular decline, and the UK is trapped in an endless loop of expenditure without investment, it begs a massive, obvious question.
Which is?
Why do so many prominent, brilliant economists keep telling us everything is fine?
Because there is a profound divergence between what is happening on the ground and what is happening on the macroeconomic spreadsheets. Which brings us to a fascinating clash of ideas, a global statistical illusion that the source calls the tale of two orthodoxies.
The video sets this up as a heavyweight battle between deeply entrenched, Nobel laureate-level economic narratives. These are the two dominant stories the West tells itself about the global economy, and the video argues they are both entirely false.
Right.
Let's start with view one, which they associate with the French economist Philippe Aghion.
So, Aguillon's view represents the dominant American narrative. It is the belief that Europe is a stagnant backwater, falling rapidly behind a galloping, hyperproductive, technologically unstoppable United States.
The American dream, basically.
This view looks at the staggering market caps of Apple, Microsoft, and NVIDIA and concludes that the U.S. is a runaway economic engine, leaving the old world eating its dust.
And view two is the exact counter-narrative, championed by heavyweights like Paul Krugman and Gabriel Zucman.
Correct. The Krugman view argues the complete opposite. It says the American narrative is a mirage built on inequality. This view argues that Europe is doing just fine, and in fact, the European social model actually generates more genuine, livable prosperity for its average citizens than the ruthless American economy does.
So, America is galloping, or Europe is a paradise. What is the source's verdict on this battle of the titans?
The source states unequivocally that both views are completely wrong.
It's flat out wrong.
They argue that this entire debate is like two passengers on the Titanic arguing over who has the better deck chair while completely ignoring the iceberg. Both the U.S. and Europe are obsessing over their relative position to one another while willfully blinding themselves to the fact that they are both steadily, irreversibly losing ground to China.
Let's break down exactly how they dismantle both of these narratives, starting with the myth of the galloping U.S. economy. Because if you look at a chart of the U.S. stock market over the last 20 years, it looks like a rocket ship. The source specifically takes aim at a widely circulated statistic that the average American is 60% richer today than they were in the year 2000.
The video calls this statistic a lie told by averages. And they use a brilliant, very relatable joke to expose the mathematical trick being played on the public.
Let's hear the joke.
Imagine a normal working-class pub in London or a dive bar in Chicago. There are 50 regular people in there having a beer.
Okay.
Suddenly, Elon Musk walks through the door.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Mathematically speaking, the moment Elon Musk steps into that room, the average net worth of every single person in that pub has just skyrocketed to over $1 billion.
Right. The math on the spreadsheet is completely technically accurate. The total wealth in the room divided by 51 people equals $1 billion each.
Exactly.
But the lived reality for the guy drinking a Guinness in the corner hasn't changed by a single penny.
Not a penny. Averages hide the extremes. The source argues that the American economy over the last 2 decades has been the macroeconomic equivalent of Elon Musk walking into a pub.
Wow.
The wealth accumulation at the very, very top, the top 1%, and really the top 0.1%, has been so stratospheric that it wildly skews the national average.
So if the average is a lie, what is the truth for a normal person?
You have to look at the median income. The median represents the exact middle of the pack, the 50th percentile.
Yeah.
If you line up every American from poorest to richest, the median is the person standing dead center.
Okay.
And when you look at the median American income, adjusted for reality, their real income has only risen about 10.5% since the year 2000.
Wait, hold on. 10.5% over 2 entire decades?
Yes.
Factoring in the inflation of housing, healthcare, and education that isn't galloping, that sounds like a flat line. How is the 60% number even legally allowed to be touted by politicians?
Because politically, the average tells a better story than the median.
Unbelievable.
But the source's critique of the U.S. economy goes much deeper than just income inequality. They take direct aim at the crown jewel of American pride, the tech boom.
Okay, let's get into that. Because even if the wealth is concentrated, surely the fact that American companies like Apple and NVIDIA dominate the globe is proof of supreme American innovation and productivity, right?
That's the standard narrative. Silicon Valley is the engine of the world.
Right.
But the source makes a fascinating, devastating distinction here. They acknowledge that the productivity gains of big tech are very real. The microchips are getting faster, the software's getting smarter, the profits are astronomical.
Right.
But they argue those gains are not intrinsically American. They are heavily, almost entirely reliant on Asian labor and Asian physical innovation.
They drop some very specific corporate names to prove this point. TSMC, ASML, Foxconn.
Yes, let's unpack these names because they represent the physical reality beneath the digital illusion. TSMC is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. They are the ones actually fabricating the microscopic, cutting-edge chips that power Apple's iPhones and NVIDIA's AI servers.
Right.
America designs them, but Taiwan physically builds them because they have the manufacturing expertise America lost.
And ASML.
ASML is a Dutch company, but its supply chain is deeply global. They are the absolute undisputed world leader in extreme ultraviolet lithography.
What does that mean?
They build the bus-sized, multi-hundred-million-dollar machines that use lasers and ultra-precise mirrors to print those chips.
Right.
Without ASML, the entire Silicon Valley hardware ecosystem stops overnight.
Oh, and then, crucially, the source points to Foxconn.
The massive manufacturing cities in China.
Yes. They note that there are 250,000 Foxconn workers in Shenzhen alone. That is the physical human labor force that actually snaps the glass and metal together to make Apple the most profitable company in human history. Okay, this requires an analogy to really solidify what the video is claiming about America. Let's use a sports metaphor.
I love a sports metaphor.
It is as if the United States is a football club that just won the global championship. The owners are in the luxury box in New York, popping champagne, taking all the credit for being the smartest franchise in the world. But when you look closely at the pitch, you realize the U.S. team didn't develop a single one of those players in their own academy. They just rented all the superstar strikers from a Taiwanese league. They borrowed the absolute best equipment from Europe, and they hired 250,000 Chinese workers to maintain the stadium for minimum wage.
And what happens when the league you're renting those players from decides they want to start their own championship team? That is exactly what China is doing right now.
Right. And to make the sports analogy even worse, the local fans in the home stadium, the American working class, are paying higher ticket prices every year and getting absolutely none of the prize money from the championship.
That is a brilliant expansion of the concept. In economic terms, the source uses a very specific phrase for this: harvesting surplus value.
Hold on. Harvesting surplus value. That is a heavy loaded phrase. It sounds like something straight out of a 19th century political economy textbook by Karl Marx. Break that down for me in the context of an iPhone.
It's a classic concept, but it's highly applicable here. Surplus value is simply the gap between what it costs to physically produce a good, including the labor, and the final price it sells for.
Right.
When a Foxconn worker in Shenzhen is paid a tiny fraction of the retail price of the iPhone they just assembled, a massive amount of surplus value is created.
Their profit margin.
Exactly. The source argues that American capital is historically phenomenally excellent at positioning itself at the very end of the global supply chain to harvest that surplus value. They book the massive astronomical profits in the boardrooms of New York or Silicon Valley.
Right, the designers and executives.
But the actual physical generation of productivity, the manufacturing, the applied engineering, the raw labor, is outsourced.
The U.S. isn't making the pie, they just own the rights to sell the slices at a premium.
Precisely. And crucially, because that harvested surplus value is funneled directly to shareholders and executives, it never trickles down to rebuild the American industrial heartland or elevate the working class.
Right.
This creates a deeply fragile, systemically unstable domestic economy, completely dependent on the very foreign powers it views as rivals.
Which perfectly sets up the second orthodoxy they want to tear down. If the U.S. statistics are skewed by extreme wealth at the top and outsourced labor at the bottom, how do economists like Paul Krugman justify the idea that Europe is a prosperous, equitable paradise? If Europe is a museum, how are brilliant economists proving that view 2 is correct?
This brings us to a fascinating critique of how we measure the world. The tool that economists use to make these cross-border comparisons is a statistical mechanism called purchasing power parity, or PPP.
For the listener, the most famous, globally accessible version of this concept is something called the Big Mac Index, published by The Economist magazine.
Right. The Big Mac Index is designed to make complex currency valuations understandable. It asks a very simple, seemingly elegant question. How many minutes of minimum wage work does it take an average person to buy a standard Big Mac in Chicago compared to someone in Munich or Athens or London?
It sounds totally logical on the surface. A Big Mac is a Big Mac. It is a highly standardized, globally identical commodity.
Yep.
2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese. It's the exact same physical object whether you are in Ohio or Italy.
Yep.
So comparing the effort to acquire it should give you a perfect baseline for prosperity, right?
It seems bulletproof. But the source argues this reliance on PPP is a fatal flaw in Western economic analysis. They argue that a Big Mac is absolutely not the same commodity in both places, and that treating it as such creates a massive delusion.
Wait, why? I've eaten a Big Mac in Paris and a Big Mac in New York. They taste exactly the same. How are they different commodities?
It's entirely about the societal context surrounding the burger.
Okay, explain that.
The source paints a very vivid cultural picture to explain this. In the United States, for a large swath of the population, a McDonald's is often viewed as a sad, utilitarian roadside pit stop. It is fast, cheap calories for people who are overworked, in a hurry, or struggling economically.
Okay, that's a fair characterization of the American fast food landscape.
But the video contrasts this with the experience of McDonald's in the center of Rome, right next to the Trevi Fountain, or a franchise in a beautiful plaza in Madrid. In many parts of Europe, that exact same McDonald's operates more like a sit-down cafe.
Oh, yeah.
Teenagers linger there for hours, families treat it as a casual weekend outing. The architecture of the building might be centuries old.
So the argument is that you aren't actually comparing the localized cost of a burger. You are comparing the cost of 2 entirely different cultural institutions that just happen to share the same Golden Arches logo.
Precisely. And by relying on the Big Mac Index and purchasing power parity, the source argues that macroeconomists are treating massive, fundamental structural differences in society as mere mathematical rounding errors.
What kind of structural differences are being ignored by the spreadsheet?
Major systemic factors. PPP completely struggles to accurately price in things like European value-added taxes, or VAT, which significantly alter the cost of living.
Right.
It ignores rigid minimum wage floors, and it glosses over massive state-funded public health subsidies that alter how much disposable income a citizen actually needs to survive. But the critique goes even deeper.
How so?
The source argues that PPP is entirely blind to what they beautifully call the unpriceable textures of daily life.
The unpriceable textures. That is a fascinating phrase. What do they mean by that?
They mean the physical, lived reality that cannot be captured in a GDP formula. A spreadsheet cannot quantify the quiet daily frustration of a student attending a theoretically free French university, only to find that the lecture halls are crumbling and the bathrooms consistently lack toilet paper because of budget cuts.
Right. The spreadsheet just sees free education and marks a massive win for Europe.
Exactly. The spreadsheet cannot price the misery of a commuter, relying on a chronically run-down German train system that has been systematically starved of investment by decades of strict constitutional debt limits.
Wow.
And it certainly cannot measure the physical exhaustion of Greek public nurses who have endured 16 uninterrupted years of severe EU-mandated economic austerity.
This spreadsheet just looks at the price of a burger, looks at the minimum wage, and says, look, parity, Europe is doing just as well as America.
Yes, the source claims that the Krugman narrative, the idea that Europe is fine, quietly assumes all of these degrading real-world textures away. Just like the America's galloping narrative quietly assumes away the financial reality of a minimum wage barista serving a $7 coffee to a tech billionaire in San Francisco.
So both models are willfully blind to the decay happening at the base of the society.
Yes. But the video also makes a really sharp, cynical point about why this specific statistical fairy tale, this idea of a European utopia, is so incredibly popular in American political discourse.
They delve into the weaponization of statistics, right?
Yes. They argue that American politicians, specifically within the Democratic Party, actively use this fairy tale of European parity as a prop for their own domestic political battles.
How so? Like, in what way?
Progressive politicians in the U.S. constantly point to an idealized utopian version of Europe to argue for policies at home. They say, look at Europe. They have month-long summer vacations, they have robust universal health care, they have strong unions, and their economies are doing just fine. We should do that here.
Which, purely from a political strategy standpoint, makes sense. If you want to change the system, you want to point to a working model to prove to voters that it's possible.
It makes sense politically, but the source argues they are pointing to a ghost. They are clinging to an image of European social democracy that existed in the 1990s. They are ignoring the fact that decades of harsh austerity, deregulation, and the exact kind of creeping privatization we discussed earlier have fundamentally hollowed out that landscape.
The video specifically brings up Sweden to hammer this point home, don't they?
They do. Sweden is perpetually held up by American progressives as the ultimate untouchable social democratic utopia.
Right, the Swedish model.
But the source points out that modern Sweden has deeply privatized massive chunks of its educational and healthcare systems, often with disastrous results similar to the UK water crisis we talked about.
So these statistics are being weaponized for domestic political points on Twitter and cable news, and in the process, they are blinding everyone, policymakers and voters alike, to the actual physical decline happening on the ground in both regions.
Exactly. The map is not the territory. Although it is important to note the source does concede that purchasing power parity isn't entirely useless. It has a very specific, terrifying application.
Which?
It is highly useful for geopolitics and military capacity rather than long-term civilian prosperity.
That is an intense pivot. When is PPP actually the right tool to use?
When you want to measure the raw physical capacity of a state to wage war or sustain an industrial base outside the global financial system?
Okay, they use a fascinating, highly relevant example regarding Russia for this.
Yes. When the conflict in Ukraine began in 2022, many Western analysts and politicians looked at Russia's GDP, converted it into US dollars, and concluded it was a remarkably small economy.
Right. I distinctly remember those headlines. People were mocking them, saying Russia's entire economy is smaller than the state of Texas, or they have the GDP of Italy. The assumption was that Western financial sanctions would instantly crush them.
But the source points out that once a country is cut off from the SWIFT system and the global US dollar market, their dollar-denominated GDP becomes totally irrelevant. What actually matters on the ground is bang for the buck.
Right.
The critical question becomes, how many actual artillery shells, tanks, and gallons of diesel fuel can your internal domestic economy physically produce using its own currency, its own raw materials, and its own labor force?
Because they aren't paying global market rates in dollars for steel, they are paying domestic rates in rubles.
Precisely. When you use purchasing power parity to measure that specific physical industrial output, a completely different reality emerges. By the PPP metric, the source notes that Russia's economy is actually significantly larger than Germany's in terms of sheer industrial capacity. They also note that Japan's economy is larger than Germany's by this metric.
So the PPP tool works perfectly if you need to measure how many tanks a country can forge in a closed loop. But it fails completely and utterly at measuring if the citizens of that country are actually living a prosperous, upwardly mobile, modern life.
Exactly. And relying on it to measure civilian prosperity is what allows European elites to maintain the illusion of success. It leads to this phenomenon where Europe increasingly markets itself as a literal museum to wealthy American and Asian tourists.
Like we were talking about earlier.
Yes. The tourists visit the beautiful, curated city centers, they experience a highly polished, superficial version of the continent, and it confirms all their pre-existing biases. Meanwhile, everyone completely ignores the underlying economic rot happening just outside the tourist zones.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps the most urgent, explosive part of this entire deep dive. This statistical blindness we've been unpacking for the last 40 minutes, it isn't just an academic problem debated by Nobel laureates in university faculty lounges.
Far from it.
It is actively causing massive real-world consequences that are tearing the political fabric apart.
Yes, because when the spreadsheets diverge completely from the lived reality of millions of people, that pressure has to go somewhere. The source argues that this profound elite misunderstanding is largely geography-based.
Geography-based?
Yeah, policymakers are physically insulated from the consequences of their own economic models.
The video introduces this brilliant concept of a geographic conversion between the United States and Europe. Walk me through this.
Think about that American tourist visiting Europe that we just discussed. They fly into Paris and they stay in the first arrondissement, near the Louvre. Or they visit the historic center of Rome or the vibrant core of central Berlin.
Beautiful places.
These European city centers are generally pristine. They're incredibly wealthy, culturally vibrant, packed with cafes and high-end retail. The American tourist looks around and thinks, wow, the European model is incredible. The cities are so alive and safe.
But the reality for the average working-class European citizen is entirely different.
Drastically different.
Yeah.
In Europe, the historic city centers have become fortresses of extreme wealth, effectively pricing out the working class entirely.
Oh, wow.
The actual population, the people who keep the city running, have been pushed to the deep outskirts, to the suburbs. In France, they call them the banlieues. And these sprawling suburban rings can be economically dire, socially neglected, and deeply disconnected from the wealth of the center.
Whereas in the United States, historically, the geographic layout of wealth is the exact opposite.
Right. Over the latter half of the 20th century in the U.S., especially in classic Midwestern industrial hubs, the source mentions Detroit specifically as the prime example. The wealth, the action, and the investment actively fled the city centers.
The classic white flight and suburbanization.
Exactly. The urban cores became dilapidated, hollowed out, and economically depressed, while the affluent populations moved out to sprawling, wealthy, highly invested suburbs.
So if you are an elite European policymaker or an American tech executive vacationing in Paris, you are physically, geographically insulated from the decline. Your daily commute, your restaurants, your neighborhoods, they all look perfectly fine.
Exactly. Their lived physical environment confirms what their flawed spreadsheets are telling them. The elites rely on what the source brutally calls the arithmetic of the year 2000.
The arithmetic of the year 2000, meaning they are using outdated models.
Meaning they're looking at specific data points that make them feel good, like stock market highs or the collapsing price of consumer tech hardware. Look, a flat-screen TV is cheaper than ever. Inflation is contained.
Right.
But they are simultaneously, willfully ignoring the skyrocketing costs of the things that actually dictate human survival and mobility.
Like what?
The cost of healthcare, the exponential rise in rent, the crippling cost of university tuition, the spiking rates for basic car insurance.
So an entire generation is looking at a spreadsheet that says everything is fine, the economy is growing, which is exactly what causes voters to look around, realize their daily life is getting significantly, tangibly harder, and decide to just completely flip the geopolitical table.
That is the ultimate ringing warning from the source material, and it is a powerful one to internalize. Stagnation announces itself at the ballot box long before it appears in a spreadsheet.
And we are seeing that announcement loud and clear all across the globe right now.
We are. The economists in this video draw a direct, undeniable causal line from this ignored economic stagnation to the massive populist political upheavals shaking the foundations of the West.
They point to specific movements.
They point directly to the rise of the May J movement in the United States, the surging popularity of the AfD in Germany, the enduring power of Marine Le Pen in France, and Nigel Farage's Reform Party in the UK.
The video argues that these movements aren't just cultural anomalies, they are direct economic symptoms.
Yeah.
They are fueled by vast working-class populations who recognize that the elite narratives of galloping prosperity or European parity are absolute lies, because their own daily lived reality is one of grinding decline.
And according to the source, the current European political establishment, rather than correcting course, is actively compounding the problem.
How? What are they doing wrong in response to this populist wave?
The video argues that European leadership is paralyzed, clinging desperately to what they call a 1990s neoliberal catechism.
Let's define neoliberal catechism for the listener, because that term gets thrown around a lot. What does that actually mean in practice for a government?
In this context, it means an unshakable religious-like belief in two core pillars: maintaining hyper-flexible, unprotected labor markets and enforcing austere, balanced budgets above all else.
So austerity.
It is the belief that the state should shrink, cut spending, and let the free market dictate terms, even during a crisis. The source argues this is exactly the wrong medicine. Europe is obsessively cutting public investment right at the exact moment they desperately need to be seeding the industries of the future to compete with China.
And compounding that internal austerity, there is the external geopolitical reality.
Yes. The video points out the profound hypocrisy of Europe's current geopolitical stance.
In what way?
Well, while demanding a reindustrialization of the continent to compete on the global stage, European leadership is simultaneously starving its own industries of the two things they need to survive:
Which are?
the cheap Russian energy that previously powered German factories, and the affordable Chinese-manufactured components that keep European supply chains viable.
Wow, so they are actively squeezing their own economies to death from both sides. They are cutting investment at home and cutting off cheap inputs from abroad, all while wondering why their industries are collapsing and their voters are angry.
The economists sum up this delusion with a truly biting critique. They say that sitting in Western think tanks, comparing the economic metrics of Detroit to Dusseldorf, while entirely ignoring the fact that Shenzhen in China is doubling its technological capacity every decade, is not serious economic analysis.
What do they call it?
It is simply, quote, nostalgia with footnotes.
Nostalgia with footnotes. That is an incredibly sharp phrase to end on. It perfectly captures the danger of living in the past.
It really does.
Okay, synthesizing this entire massive journey we've been on today, from local British water pipes leaking sewage into the sea, to the complex realities of Chinese AI funding, to the statistical illusions of the Big Mac Index. What is the core unifying issue connecting all these dots?
If we pull all these disparate threads together, the core argument of the source is that the fundamental crisis facing the West is a total inability of the state to acquire the capacity to build things again.
State capacity.
Yes. Whether it is acquiring land for a high-speed rail line, managing a functional healthcare system without layers of parasitic bureaucracy, or aggressively seeding a cutting-edge technological sector.
They have completely lost the institutional muscle memory of how to build the future.
Yes. The state has forgotten how to be an active participant in the economy. And the warning is clear. Until the Western state relearns how to build and how to properly catalyze innovation, private investment will remain grounded.
Right.
It will continue to seek short-term surplus value, like extracting dividends from a failing water company, rather than driving long-term societal progress.
Let's recap the critical aha moments from this incredibly dense, paradigm-shifting deep dive. Number one, expenditure is absolutely not the same thing as investment.
Right. Fixing a massive sewage leak created by private equity debt might cost billions and boost the GDP on paper, but it is not the same as funding the next major technological leap. Crisis management is not growth.
Exactly. Number two, the dominant narrative of the booming American tech economy obscures a deep vulnerability.
The U.S. is heavily reliant on Asian labor and foreign manufacturing. It has built an economy incredibly skilled at harvesting value at the top, but fundamentally failing to generate broad, inclusive prosperity at the base.
Number three, the idea of European economic parity is largely a statistical mirage.
It is bolstered by flawed, outdated metrics like the Big Mac Index, which completely ignore the crumbling, unpriceable reality of daily life: the rundown trains, the underfunded universities, the exhausted nurses.
And finally, number four, while the West wastes time debating these flawed spreadsheets and clinging to the nostalgia of the 1990s, China is rapidly outpacing both the U.S. and Europe.
They are achieving this by utilizing a radically different model of aggressive, state-funded, hyper-competitive innovation that forces domestic companies to evolve or die.
So directly to you listening, the next time you are scrolling through your newsfeed on your phone and you see a blaring headline celebrating massive GDP growth or a politician taking credit for a record-breaking high in the stock market, I want you to pause. Based on everything we've unpacked today, ask yourself a question. Are you looking at a number that represents actual, physical, productive investment in the future of your country? Or are you just looking at a financialized elite successfully harvesting surplus value, while the underlying infrastructure of society continues to quietly rust away?
It is the most vital question you can ask as a citizen today, and leads directly to a final thought. I want to leave you with something to genuinely mull over that builds on everything we've just discussed.
Lay it on us.
The source makes a highly compelling, almost terrifying argument that the Chinese model of state-funded do-or-die innovation is currently winning the 21st century. They argue forcefully that the European model of heavy regulation is failing, and the UK model of bloated, debt-laden privatization is an absolute disaster.
It paints a very stark picture of the options available.
But here is the ultimate provocation. If the economists are right, and the only way out of the European Museum is to completely adopt the aggressively capitalist, highly pressurized, fiercely competitive systems of either the United States or China, is it even mathematically or culturally possible for a Western country to maintain its cherished social safety nets?
That is the trillion-dollar question.
Can a society genuinely keep the month-long summer vacations, the universal public health systems, the strict labor protections, and the fundamental work-life balance, while simultaneously trying to fiercely compete in a cutthroat 21st century technological arms race?
Yeah.
Or is the ultimate unspoken price of leading global innovation the complete and total sacrifice of the European way of life?
Wow. That is a heavy, structural, almost existential question. It really makes you wonder if that macroeconomic X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning isn't just broken, but if I've actually been using it to look at the entirely wrong patient for the last 20 years.
Exactly.
We'll leave you to think on that. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the spreadsheets. Keep looking closely at the physical reality on the ground in your own neighborhoods.
And remember, as the source pointed out in their one rare piece of optimistic news sometimes, a team's collective brilliance, much like Spain winning the World Cup, can still overcome a landscape of dazzling individualism.
Keep digging deeper, and thanks for listening.